right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? It's really loud in here. I also want to give everyone an A+ for coming to a session first. I know the doors just opened, so I love seeing all these faces here. So thanks for coming and kicking off DevLearn with us. As a quick introduction, I'm Tammy Rutherford. I'm the Managing Director at Rustasy Software. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're the nerds in the room. We're the ones that specialize in these e-learning standards called SCORM, XAPI, CMI5. If there's an acronym, we're probably involved somewhere along the way. And I'm really excited to have with me one of our longstanding customers, Dan Dabobian, who is the head of innovation for the SANS Institute. They are the global leaders in cybersecurity training and certification. So they're the guys that are out there helping us all stay secure and safe on the web. So I'm really happy to have him here. And today we're going to talk about ways that we have been working together to help improve how SANS has reimagined their content distribution model. And so Dan's going to tell us a little bit more about what that looks like here in just a moment. We go way back. So SANS and Rustasy have been working together for over a decade. And back in 2015, a really serendipitous moment happened. Rustasy was working on a content as a service, sort of a distribution model, trying to elevate a product that we had called Dispatch that you might be familiar with, and try to really think about how to solve problems for content publishers specifically. And it just so happened that we bumped into Dan at a conference just like this one in 2015. And he had a lot of things to share with us. So he was more than willing to provide insights around how things get complicated when you're distributing content across multiple clients, and was more than willing to share and collaborate with us, and then provided a lot of insight and inspiration for where Content Controller has ended up today. So I'm really happy for Dan to join us and share a little bit more about the before days, before they changed their distribution model, and what they've been able to achieve with Content Controller.
Thanks, Tammy. And I'm hoping everybody can hear me. I'll try to speak loud. It is rumbling loud in here. And thanks for that intro. Basically, if I kind of talk just for a second about what situation we were in and what situation we are in and what changed, our role, like the way that we do business, is to make a large number of multilingual content modules, and then we distribute them out to the world. We sell them to people with their own LMSs. We have a very large commercial LMS that we use to host people who may not have an LMS or may not have an LMS that they like very much, which most people seem to fit into that boat. But like largely we had at the time 700-800 clients that had their own LMSs. So our challenge was to take hundreds of modules, anywhere from 2 to 3 minutes. Some of the modules are coming out right now are 2 to 3 days long, and push them out into that network in a way. We'd sell them under an annual contract license, and we'd have to package them up on a customer by customer basis and say, here's your SCORM packages, here's your SCORM packages. If you don't know what that is, that's just a way that we can build content to push it out to industry standard LMSs that then consume that content where they house it, hold it, and deliver it to their learners. The thing on the left represents what we were doing. We would package those modules up for every customer, configure them for every customer, tweak them if the packages needed tweaking, and then distribute to them what those packages were. And they would range in size anywhere from megabytes to gigabytes. Some of our content now is many gigabytes. So we had both a packaging situation and a delivery situation where, you know, that content just got pushed out into that ecosystem. A little bit about what Content Controller is before we kind of get into feature by feature. It's a place that we can hold the content and then give everybody out in those networks, all of our customers, access to the content in a way that's just, the files are smaller, they're maintained in a big central repository, and everybody pretty much gets the same files. So we're not dealing with a lot of this person gets these files, they get that file. This is an old version of Moodle from 2009, which I promise you still exists. What do we have to do to that file to get it out to them? So there's a bunch of different pieces of Content Controller that we're going to talk about and why we're using them a lot. We have now over 1,000 customers, probably 2.5-3 million end user learners, but that doesn't mean that you have to have that situation to use this stuff. If you're making content that you want to push out into a number of LMSs or even one big central LMS, there are reasons that this solution really made sense, at least for us. So we should probably start going through slide by slide.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, so as Dan mentioned, in the pre-days, you've got a copy of a course, multiple out there. So that's a lot to wrangle. And there's a lot of places that can break down pretty quickly. So tell us I think versioning was sort of the first pain point we explored together.
Right.
And how do you update courses when they're scattered all about?
Right. So like, just to give you a little background, we, at the time when we started doing this in 2015, had about between 60 and 100 course modules that we would deliver as individual SCORM packages out to our customer base. Not everybody got all of them, but almost everybody got about 50. When we're pushing those out, we're giving you the content. Here it is, load it into your LMS, do what you want. That was great when there were a small number of customers. And if you're just making content for yourself, that's a pretty acceptable model. But when you're pushing that content, so you got 50 modules pushed out to 500 customers, that's a lot of content out there. And then slide 3 of module 7 has a spelling mistake in it. Or the language, we produce our content now in about 45 languages. If there's a mistake in translation, which is inevitable in some cases, and we do a lot of quality control, lots. We are very, quality is the name of the game for our customers, quality and security correctness, right? So if we find some kind of a problem in one of those modules in those days, all you need to do is to call all 600 customers, send them all a brand new SCORM package or multiple SCORM packages, convince the LMS guy or gal that they need to do the thing that maybe they're only doing once a year, which is to re-import that content. Some of them, we actually were spending a lot of time doing that with or for them every time you find a mistake. And that just wasn't practical. So we were in a bit of a conundrum as we were growing and being successful, and doing the best we could for quality control. We would still find mistakes. And basically what would happen is those corrected modules never got pushed into 90% of those LMSs because either, we couldn't get them pushed out in time, or they just didn't have the time or aptitude or interest to take those corrections and put them into their module set. So the ability to do versioning centrally, now the way that this works, we have one copy of that module. It sits in Content Controller. We push out what's called a dispatch package to all of those LMSs. Very similar to what we were doing before, except the files are teeny tiny. They go out once and they sort of let's just call them a universal connector to whatever LMS that you're using. There's a lot less complexity. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when we update that file centrally and we QC it, look at it, test it, publish this version, every customer in that network, everybody who's got that content anywhere, now has the new version of that corrected module. That is, for us at least, because our content is kind of dynamic, mistakes happen, and we really care to have the latest, greatest content out there into our customers' hands, was a critical function of this technology. Saying it reduced headaches and costs is a wild understatement, but it just caused better quality content to be in the hands of our customers, which is something that, even if it cost more, we would have done. So thankfully we could do it this way and also do it for less.
That's excellent. And I think the other thing that when we think about versioning, Dan's describing a pretty complex distribution network for all of his customers all over the world. But even organizations that use multiple LMSs internally have a very similar problem. Versioning isn't an easy task, even if it's just 1 or 2 LMSs that you have to update courses for. That might take a half a day for an LMS administrator to get in there, upload it, maybe even reassign it. And then I don't think we even want to talk about what happens to the learner. Do they have to start all over again? Who wants to look at that person and say, sorry, that hour you just spent in that course, you have to start over because oopsies, there was a typo on slide 25.
Yeah, and I didn't mention that, but you have the option to preserve or reset progress as you're doing that versioning. So that's absolutely critical. The last thing I want to do is to tell 2 million learners that they need to repeat some 4-minute module in order to have their training completed for that year. And that's a very, very important point, is that the progress gets maintained throughout the entire system.
So we'll jump over to compatibility, and Dan, you started to get into this a little bit with sort of the inputs and the outputs of Content Controller. And I'll brag on SANS and Dan's team. for just a minute. One of the things they're doing, they're quite innovative when it comes to XAPI and CMI5. So they're ahead of the curve on some of the standards. Stephen Kalnowski is actually speaking about their use case with XAPI right after this. But they're able to do it. One of the reasons why they're able to stay ahead of that curve is because Content Controller enables them to. So tell us a little bit about that compatibility moment.
Yeah, for sure. So like at the time in 2015, we were supporting 67 different LMSs out in the market. And they were, I mean, it's like the early days of printers. You had to like tweak little settings and do this and change that to get each one to work, regardless of whether your content was consistent and well produced. You still had to goof around with them a little bit. Content Controller for us means we can upload our content in the format of development, and we tend to push that envelope pretty far forward. So we're developing all of our courseware now in CMI5. It's loaded with XAPI experience statements so that we could tell what's going on. But, surprisingly, not all LMSs know how to deal with CMI5. In fact, I don't know if there are any LMSs that natively want to absorb CMI5 modules. That doesn't mean I don't want to produce them in CMI5, because I want to future-proof our content and I want the data that sort of thing enables. What Content Controller does is we upload the course into it in CMI5, and then it, much like say a printer driver, does the translation into whatever format that you want to receive it into your LMS. So if you're higher ed and you like LTI, boop, here you go. If you're like the majority of our customers are SCORM 1.2 people, here it goes. It's in and it works. It doesn't matter if your LMS does what we're doing. It matters that Content Controller is doing what you're doing. And it also preserves that XAPI process so that if we have XAPI statements in SCORM, if we put them inside of modules that are developed in CMI5, Content Controller will receive those statements from the browser and forward them off to an LRS, regardless of kind of like what's going on inside of that LMS itself. Very, very useful. And, I think the other thing is, we use XAPI for a bunch of different reasons. One of them is product development and understanding of how people are using our content. If we don't get that data back, I don't know what languages people are watching content in. I don't know what the durations that they're spending. I don't know if they're rewinding and fast forwarding. This gives us a really good place to have that data come back and get reflected then into our LRS systems, where we can understand that content use. We don't just do that for diagnostics. We do that to understand if somebody's watching the passwords module in Polish, and if they're not, we can then send that to our product people and say, maybe that's not worth that expensive translation and QC process investment. So that makes that very, very easy. And it also makes it so that, we don't have to worry about what LMS you're running. There's one other feature that's cool inside a Content Controller. If you're using LMS A, you're supporting that in one of your customer bases, and the LMS puts up an exit button so that you can exit that module at the end of it. Guess what? There's another LMS or many other LMSs that don't do that. They expect the content to have an exit button in it. So I'm trying to make one piece of content because I'm, kind of lazy and I don't want to make 27 versions. Content Controller gives us the ability to set different switches for different customer profiles. Say this customer is a Moodle user. They need an exit button. This one is a Cornerstone. They don't need an exit button. And we could set those up in a customer profile. And we'll talk a little bit more about licensing later. And then when that dispatch package is produced, customer gets it, they get an exit button. Customer gets it, they don't get an exit button. Content is agnostic to that process. That's in the course publication system. One other thing I'll mention is we have gone from modules that are megabytes to gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes. Some of our courses are now 50 gigabytes large. If you think about, and so say somebody has 10 course modules they want to put in, that's half a terabyte of data. So like, I get it, internet, fiber, blah, blah, blah. I'm telling you from experience, distributing half a terabyte of data to 1,000 customers is problematic. A lot of them can't download a file that big. They don't want to store a file that big. LMSs can't consume a file that big, but with 4K video and long form, that's just a reality. We upload gigabytes into Content Controller, and I kid you not, download kilobytes, 10 kilobyte dispatch package into all those client LMSs. So whatever the digital equivalent of a postage stamp is, that's what you need to put 100 courses that you can then send out into that ecosystem. Everybody loads them in, and then when the content gets played, it pulls down the gigabytes from the Content Controller itself. Very, very good feature.
Cool. And, one of the things that as Dan's describing what this means in his world, I'll try to bring it back to organizations that have similar problems, probably slightly different scale. So one of the places we hear people starting to leverage content controller internally, I call it the LMS helper. So it allows you to develop in the content, the standards that you want to be using, whether your LMS is there or not. So if you do, you're going to hear some great things this week as it relates to XAPI, VR, AR, CMI5. You're going to come home inspired. And Content Controller allows you to have that inspiration to develop content in the format that you want it to be in, regardless of the LMS that you're using today, or potentially the LMS your IT department might be buying for you in the future, whether they asked you anything about it or not. So we do see organizations leveraging this to sort of boost or add features and functionality to the LMS that they have without doing any major surgery. No, you don't have to do any development work here. It's really just a matter of using those proxy files to talk to your LMS in the way and language that it understands.
A good example of that, like we have also, like I mentioned, a large commercial LMS that we own that our customers can use a tenancy on if they would like. We still use Content Controller, even though it's our LMS in the same space, in the same place, just because it adds some value as far as content compatibility, licensing control, things like that are still very difficult to do in commercial LMSs. So like they don't, they all seem to have some kind of hitch in their giddy up that Content Controller make a little easier. So even in the case when we would only be like having one or two LMSs, we would still probably end up using this product.
Excellent. We're going to move on because we're going to run out of time.
Yep.
So multi-language support, this was not on Rusticy's radar when we were envisioning Content Controller. This was definitely a problem that Dan brought to us and very clearly expressed the challenges that come with managing multiple languages for every one of your course titles.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we were sitting at DevLearn somewhere, maybe it was at ATD, and we rolled up to one of the folks at Rusticy and started sketching out something on a napkin that turned into something very quickly. The problem we had was this: we were running an LMS, we were producing content in about 45 languages, and basically the way we're producing content meant that we needed to create 45 language versions of that content, load 45 versions of that into our LMS. And then the nightmare was, us and all of our customers, was that we had to have them then figure out which group of users get this language, who gets Spanish, who gets German, who gets Italian, who gets Croatian. And that was just, a crushing problem for the administrator, which is our customer, of that content. So what we proposed was, and like I'm super good at describing things in a fuzzy way and hoping there's some technical person in the room that can go, yes, that we could do that. And we just happened to have that moment, which was, is there some way that we could load one file into an LMS and that file would lead to some kind of a thing, and that thing would allow the user to select a language, and based on that selection, it would play a piece of content out of the Content Controller, rather than, so the LMS doesn't even necessarily know or understand that content is in 30, 40, 50 languages. It's sitting in Content Controller in 30, 40, 50 languages. They assign course module A to everyone, one module assigned to that population as part of a learning path or what have you. The learner fires it up, they hit play. The first thing they encounter is a dropdown that says, what language would you like to watch this content in? They click Polish, German, Italian, whatever. The system not only plays the content, but it remembers that choice. So later in the content viewing experience, they can change that, but they don't have to answer that question again. We don't want to ask them. We do a lot of training that's compliance and mandatory training. They're not thrilled about it to begin with. The last thing that we want to do is, pepper them with questions about language every time they run a different module. So keeps track of it. And then basically whatever languages are available in that content, it plays it in. If we do encounter a module that maybe isn't in that language, there's a fallback language that it'll drop into, and it'll re-ask them the question if they want to change to a different language. So that has been a huge win, not just for us, but for all of the LMS administrators and for all of the viewers of that content that don't have to deal with language course alignment anymore. It's just like, boom, done, works great.
So it's interesting. I know for me and probably many others here coming to this conference this week, I've started getting emails from all the translating services that are on the floor this week that want to translate your content for you. And that's just part of the problem, right? So it is fantastic to create courseware and have it in the language for all of your learners. But what Dan's describing is the other side of the equation, administering all of those languages. And it can get unwieldy, and it still might not be that user-friendly at the end of the day if they still have to rely on somebody to make a choice for them and know to assign them that right language. So this takes a lot of the heavy lifting off of your LMS administrators and just makes it for a better learner experience.
Right, and to combine that with the conversation about versioning, each one of those language modules is its own thing in Content Controller. So if the French version is wrong, I don't have to open the whole course, and then I can just go and basically version the French version. Next person who gets it, they get that change. And if you're doing a lot of translated content, you probably can empathize with the fact that there are always that feedback from the folks in Germany that the way that we worded something or phrased something, especially for us in a technical world, that is a common occurrence of having to revise that content. So super good stuff.
Excellent. We're going to wrap up with the last feature, and this is really the core of what Content Controller was designed to do from the very beginning. As Dan described earlier, when we saw that sort of like scattered courses all over the place, that really meant two really important things. One, your IP, your intellectual property was living on someone else's server. You had no idea what was happening with it. And so Content Controller, the first class citizen here, is to make sure that the content, the access to that content is something that the creator has control over, to decide who has access to it, visibility into not only who's accessing and how frequently are they and should they. So kind of giving those levers or controls back to the creator, the publisher, to say, here, empower you to decide how do you want your courseware to be accessed. So tell us a little bit more about what you were doing there.
Right. So like exactly like Tammy said, back in the day, you get a score module and we trust you to use it the way that we say for the periods of, the 1-year license. We use a named user play license. So each individual user is allowed to watch any module as many times as they like throughout the course of their contract, which is typically a year. Give them 40 modules. They kind of do what they want. The problem is we have no idea if that's what they were doing. And actually, we're kind of interested in knowing what they're doing, as well as, there's just no way your content's out. There's no way to get it back. It is what it is. The way this works, the initiating LMS, when it launches content on behalf of a user, so it's in the browser, it knows who I am. I launch it. Content Controller says, Dan, as identified by whatever your LMS thinks of as identities, numbers, email addresses, whatever, just played this module. There's a license provision for a bunch of modules. So, like a whole set of modules could count against that license. It counts how many individual and unique learner IDs cross and play that content. When it hits a threshold, it can do a bunch of different things. It could cut them off at the knees and say, like, you're out of licenses. We don't do it that way. We never want to do it that way because we don't want to sort of, cause an event for our customers that all of a sudden 1,000 people are trying to play content and they can't. We just set an overage limit, and then it notifies us that that customer is past their threshold. And then we have a salesperson call them and say, like, hey, looks like maybe next time we up your license, you might need to buy a few more. It actually creates a great opportunity for us to right size those licenses up or down. It also gives us the ability to, understand how many unique users at an organization are using their content. We look at underutilization as a problem. Like somebody buys 1,000, we want them to use 1,000, right? Like, so also it gives us the ability to understand all of the things that we talked about before. What language are they watching that content in? What license duration are they up against? Like if they buy that content, we can have that license expire after a year. We do actually use that period with a grace period so that, they don't have that content forever. So very, very useful feature. And, especially if you're a content producer who's trying to basically put your content out into the marketplace, and that intellectual property that's your currency, right? Like, so that's the thing that you actually want to know how it's getting used and protect it without inconveniencing anyone. I think that's the other thing is this is no burden on the customers at all. They barely, their LMSs are doing what LMSs do. Learner A, launch content B, give me that content. We got the content. It keeps track of that stuff. So very useful.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the conversations that comes up pretty quickly when we talk to people about content controller is to say, how many learners do you have? What's the size of your population? And Dan, you just described it. The answer often is, I don't know. It should be 100, but I don't know for sure. So that's one, that visibility is critical, just in understanding the scope and utilization of your content. But then going back to that product development or insight, you end up getting data back at the course level. So aggregate across all of your clients, what courses are being used, how. So you get some analytics there to inform your product development teams.
Yeah.
Along with your sales teams.
Sometimes those analytics, customers actually want to take the analytics of content usage to their bosses and their funding agents and say, like, look at, people are using this content like crazy. We probably want to continue this program next year. So like we could give them access to that data. They can download it, things like that, print reports that show utilization, across those product lines. Cause like they're doing internal sales a lot of times to try to get at our content as well. So.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up for now. We're going to be available. So you can find me at booth 801. Dan will be around as well. But really just to recap, it's been a great relationship so far. You guys have seen a ton of efficiencies when it comes to managing courseware and really.
Yeah. So, and basically numbers, right? Like just in case you're trying to understand why we did this from a commercial standpoint, like there's obviously quality, customer experience, student experience reasons that we care about. But along the lines, like we were supporting 70 different LMSs. We had 2, 3, 4 full-time people. That's what they were doing. We had help desks that were dealing with this score module didn't play in that LMS. And can you change this manifest and yada, yada, yada. And we were producing all of our content in a very sort of least common denominator way so that we didn't, upset some of the old LMSs that we were supporting. And, like when we were done, and significantly, I'd say, 90, 95% reduction in the amount of staff that we needed to build and support those modules, because you're literally just pulling a lever. Here's your modules. They're tiny. They're easy to distribute. At the time, cost estimate, $100,000, very conservative with how much money that probably saved us. This is a long time ago in the growth arc of our company, and basically we're still supporting about 44 languages. So like everybody in that equation is pretty much better for that investment that we had made at the time. It was also great to work with these guys because we were kind of inventing some of this stuff as we went along, as Tammy indicated, and they were fantastic. We managed to sort of convince them this was good for the product, good for the community, and it's really worked out well. So.
Well, thanks for making the trip in. So Dan gets the prize. He landed last night, I think, after 12 o'clock at night. So definitely wins the award for coming out here and doing this with us. Thank you all for joining us for the first session of DevLearn. And like I said, slides are there. So if you did see slides and want to grab some of the resources that we talked through today, that QR code should get you there. And you can find us at booth 801 all week. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy DevLearn.